Good evening everyone, welcome to an Cyclone Chasers update today, the 12th of January 2013. Today we're going to talk about Tropical Cyclone Narelle, or Severe Tropical Cyclone Narelle, pushing towards the south-southwest off the coast of WA. Not going to spend too much time on her today because the chances of her affecting the coast as a cyclone are going to diminish, whereas the next cyclone that could potentially form over the northwest may have slightly higher chances of affecting the coastline directly. We'll talk a bit more about that in more detail tonight, and we'll also start talking about the Gulf country because the Gulf country looks like it's going to fire up in around about just over a week's time. So stay with us tonight over our update to find out more about those areas. Issued at 5 PM Queensland time here, we see Tropical Cyclone Narelle actually made it to Category 5 there for a small period today, but will eventually weaken out to a Category 3 system off Exmouth, Category 2 off Carnarvon, and will continue to decrease in intensity quite quickly, and will start to become a lot more asymmetrical as it heads further to the south, as it encounters increasing wind shear, more dry air, and cooler sea surface temperatures. You can see the track agreement tightening now. The grey error margin not so wide, but it is still fairly long, so we're not quite sure exactly how fast it's going to move, but we are pretty confident now, or the bomb, sorry, is pretty confident now on its direction, as opposed to a couple of days ago where we had a fairly large error margin in terms of width and a very small error margin in terms of length. Now it's sort of the opposite. Very small error margin in terms of where it's going to go, large error margin in how fast it's going to get there. Looking at the forecast track from the Joint Typhoon Warning Centre, very similar, probably a little bit slightly offshore compared to the Bureau, but we see a general weakening trend and eventually an extratropical transition. There is a larger error margin in the Joint Typhoon Warning Centre forecast over the course of the next 3 to 4 days, but it's very similar a trend in weakening and keeping the system offshore even at its far eastern outlier. We can see the system still looks pretty good. It's still an intense tropical cyclone, so it's still going to have all the structural features that we expect from a Category 4 system. Still got a fairly nice looking eye. It's pretty ragged today, but it was very nice looking earlier on in the day when it did manage to get itself upgraded to a 5. But as I say, it only upgraded for a little while. And if we have a look at what the conditions are that it's going to be tracking into, we see that the system's forecast track is going to put it through increasing levels of wind shear, and we see here the system lying in about 20 knots, and the wind shear will continue to increase as the system heads to the south. So that's going to shear the system away. That means the top's going to push out towards the south or southeast, and the bottom is going to try and continue on its track towards the south-southwest or south or southwest. So overall, we'll see a weakening trend purely and simply due to wind shear, but when we start overlaying some other things to that wind shear, we see not only does wind shear increase, but sea surface temperatures decrease, and anything lower than the green here is going to kill a tropical cyclone because it won't be providing enough energy for the cyclone to sustain its warm core. So as soon as it gets past this green area, to the west of, or just probably to the west of about Coral Bay, it should start to weaken purely and simply from the lack of ocean heat. So add to that the fact that it's getting into higher wind shear values, as we said, 30-40 knots plus as it heads towards the south. We might see this rapidly decrease in intensity, a little more than some of the agencies are suggesting if these things come together. If we also then have a look at drier air, so drier air alone will kill this system in about 2 days' time, without the added fact that it's going into a wind shear environment. This is an image here showing you how much water's in the atmosphere, or how much moisture's in the atmosphere. Anything in the browns, greys, browns and oranges means it's in a very nice moist environment. As soon as it gets into the blue or purple, it gets into some very dry environments, and once a cyclone gets into that area, it can't sustain its convection, can't sustain its thunderstorms around its center. So even if there was no wind shear, even if there was higher oceanic heat down here, the fact that it's getting into such dry air and there's no real moisture advecting into the area over the next couple of days, we should see the system dive fairly rapidly once it gets into this region here, just to the southwest of Coral Bay, or well to the southwest of Coral Bay. We should start to see a lot of dry air entrainment. Once that gets into the circulation, its hours will be numbered. So just looking at what the models are suggesting, these are 4 global models: the GFS, CMC, UK Met, and No Gaps. Very, very clear on direction, just not very clear on speed, and that's reflected in the Bureau of Meteorology's forecast track, with that grey error margin a lot longer than it is wider. You can see here very tight agreement between 4 of the major global models, and the European somewhere in between all of these. So very, very tight agreement with all of our model members at the moment. So pretty clear where this is going to go, and pretty clear that it's going to head into some very unfavourable conditions after about, or maybe even 24 to 36 hours, but definitely after about 48 hours should be starting to get into some pretty terrible conditions after 48 hours. Okay, and looking at which direction it should be moving over the next couple of days, the actual deep layer mean steering flow, very, very clear here. It's going to be moving towards the south-southwest, and eventually it's going to try to recurve back to the southeast. You can start to see these westerly winds in the upper levels or the mid levels of the atmosphere. They're going to try and push the system back towards the south-southeast. Probably still at this stage south-southeast instead of southeast, so may not even see a coastal crossing. It's a bit hard to say. Look, if it does end up crossing the coast in the southern part of WA, it won't do so as a tropical cyclone. And it probably won't do so as a significant system unless it sort of joins up with a trough system and becomes extra tropical. Then you might see a little bit of weather associated with it. But at this point in time, most of the models keep it offshore over the extended frame and pushing to the south of WA. So that's where we're going to leave this one, because its impact on the coastline. Yes, you're on a cyclone warning, and yes, you may see gales with gusts to 100 kilometres an hour or so, maybe even a little bit more, depending on exact trajectory over the next 6 to 12, maybe 18 hours. But other than that, unless it does something we really don't expect it to, it's going to have pretty minimal impacts on the coastline for such a severe system. So let's drift our attention now to the next tropical cyclone possible over the northwest of Australia. Okay, to do that we need to first look into the Northern Territory, because this is where this thing's going to come from. So a slow-moving monsoon trough strengthening over the Arafura Sea. A weak low has already formed, which is a little bit earlier than we expected, and is expected to develop further as it moves west into the Timor Sea over the next few days. Now this lies at about 100 kilometres, 200 kilometres offshore at about 9 south, 134 east. Now this has a very low potential of forming tomorrow, a low potential on Monday, but a moderate potential, which is 20 to 50% on the Tuesday, of forming into a tropical cyclone as it pushes west into the Timor Sea and off the North Kimberley coastline. So if we look at the Bureau in WA, a weak low, basically saying the same thing about the low in Northern Territory, expected to move southwestwards and may enter the western region on Tuesday. Its potential for development will be monitored over the coming days. Look, most of the modelling suggesting this is going to be a tropical cyclone, but we can't take that for gospel yet. There's still a lot of variables in play, but at this stage the models are very bullish about making this one a cyclone. Okay, so on Monday we're seeing that area of low pressure just here in the Timor Sea. Anywhere, the ensemble, this is the Euro, sorry, by the way I'm showing you, that you can see the model just not exactly clear on the exact location of this, but overall we see it just somewhere between the Tiwis and East Timor and the North Kimberley coast. So somewhere in there is the low that we're watching. We can also see Tropical Cyclone Narelle down here off the coast of pretty well Coral, just south of Coral Bay, getting closer to Carnarvon there, but well west of the coastline. You can also see a little bit of variability in the model guidance at 48 hours. At day 3, we start to see a little bit more agreement as to where this low is going to be. Just in there, in this little lighter green shading, is where it's going to be. So you can see it's pushing towards the probably the west-southwest there. You can also see a Tropical Cyclone Narelle remaining offshore, or whatever remains of Tropical Cyclone Narelle, if she's been downgraded by that stage, off the coast of Geraldton, well off the coast still, and remaining that way. But overall, this is the area we're watching for the next one, and this is by Tuesday morning. By Wednesday morning, we're starting to see a little bit more deepening of this system as it continues to track more southwesterly and lies well to the north of the Pilbara coastline on Wednesday morning. Thursday morning, we see almost every member of the European finding some either a low or a cyclone out here. But the variability in the guidance at that point in time looks at either the lower cyclone could be just off the coast of Exmouth all the way through to near Headland. So a lot of variability in the models. Most of them favouring a more westerly solution here between Exmouth and Karratha and just off the coast too. So that's what we're looking at by Thursday. And the other thing that we need to start talking about on Thursday is the development of a little bit of lower pressure just near the southern Gulf country. By Friday, we see a huge variability in the guidance here between a very much a southwest solution or down here towards Exmouth and a more northerly solution further up into the southeast Indian Ocean. So a fair bit of model disagreement here by next Friday to be expected. You're talking 6 days and you're talking a tropical cyclone which is already unpredictable out to 2 days. So you're going to see that sort of variability in the guidance. Still looking at this southern Gulf, you can see here just generalised areas of lower pressure through an inland trough over inland Australia, and then the northern extent of that inland trough may merge with some monsoonal northwesterlies coming through. Starting to see that maybe next weekend over the top end and the Gulf country. By next Saturday, we're still looking at this area now, designated 1,004 hectopascals, but possibly lower. So it could already be a tropical cyclone, or it could be a fairly deep monsoonal type low at the top end of an inland trough, or at where the boundary between the northwesterly monsoon, the inland trough, all sort of combine into the one area of convergence here, and that could be what the model's picking up as a low pressure system. So either way, there's a lot of rain coming in this region with that development. So a lot of rain in the Gulf country, a lot of rain over the Western Peninsula. Let's have a look at what some of the other models are showing us about these two systems. Okay, if we take a look at the GFS ensemble on Wednesday, we see a potential tropical cyclone developing off the North Kimberley coastline. Pretty similar to the European at this point in time. Maybe a little bit more bullish than the Euro, but to be expected, the GFS model does tend to spin up cyclones a little bit more regularly than the European. So it's something to watch here. Same area as the Euro, so a very good agreement when we've got two ensembles suggesting the same spot for the same type of development. So this is really the hot spot mid next week, and then pushing to the southwest. However, this model suggests that the steering flow of this system may not be as set in stone as the European seems to suggest it is. By Thursday, we see the tropical cyclone developing, but we don't know exactly where. We see some of the model members developing it here, some of the model members developing it much further to the southwest. So you can see already at day 5, there's a fair bit of variability there as to what's going to be making this system move. And so once we start heading past that, I think we start heading into areas where we're just not confident enough to actually even make a call after that. So I think that's where we'll leave the GFS ensemble, but suffice to say we do expect a cyclone from both modelling developing out here off the North Kimberley coast sometime around mid to late next week. The Canadian model, very bullish as well. The Canadian model ensemble, this is not just the Canadian model, so this is all of its ensemble members, and we can see once again tropical cyclone off basically Broome there, and about a 990 or 988 hectopascal, so about category 2 type system there on Thursday. If we track what the CMC ensemble does with it, the CMC ensemble basically pushes it directly to the east and crosses the coast somewhere between Broome and Derby. As I say, there's a lot of variability in the guidance about whether it's going to push more southwest, which is a much more favoured solution. Based on climatology alone, we don't often see cyclones just push directly east in the North Kimberley region. So climatology alone, without even looking that far ahead at the steering influences, will tell us that that's an unlikely scenario. It has happened, but it is unlikely in comparison to the other scenarios, which is a more southwesterly motion. Okay, so if we look at but going back to the GFS ensemble now, because I want us to focus more on the Gulf of Carpentaria low pressure system, we see that the Gulf low out here forms on the Saturday morning next week, out here on the southwestern Gulf. And if we have a look at which way that should be tracking from there, we see a general quasi-stationary or slightly eastward motion of the system into just the southern Gulf, basically the south central Gulf, and not moving anywhere really in a hurry, but it is there, and it's still not showing signs on either model, the European or the GFS ensembles, of it actually forming into a cyclone at this point in time. But it is showing signs that it's a very deep low, and it's got a very, very deep monsoon fetch to its north. Now, if this happens, if this scenario eventuates anywhere to the north of, say, Cairns or Cooktown even, is going to cop the start of a wet season. Now, if the system moves a little bit further to the east, and particularly, sorry, the northeast top end as well as most of the Gulf country, the system moves a little bit further to the east and starts to get close to the western peninsula, then we're starting to talk the onset of the wet season next weekend or early the week after, in the northern parts of Queensland, anywhere sort of Mackay, Townsville northwards. And looking at the Euro ensemble at next Sunday, we've got that low there, and if we look at it next Monday, we have the low pushing eastwards again on the Monday into the south central Gulf. So the Euro's around about a day or so behind the GFS in spinning this low up, but we're certainly looking at a definite possibility here, or probability in fact, of a tropical low forming in the southern Gulf. But look, folks, the big area to watch over the next 5 days or so is going to be this North Kimberley development of a new cyclone, and then our focus will shift to the Gulf. If something ends up looking like hitting this region, we may decide to, or we probably will decide to, deploy and chase it if it's going to look like a reasonable system. We probably won't chase a monsoon low, but if this becomes into a cyclone, we'll be well and truly contemplating chasing it out here. There's been very little rainfall in the Gulf country so far this season, so the road should be quite passable for us for the time being. But as I say, the big area to watch is this Pilbara coastline for a possible impact from a tropical cyclone next weekend, or even very late next week. Alright folks, thanks very much for watching tonight, and we'll have another update for you on the 13th of January 2013.